Beautiful Anonymous changes each week. It defies genres and expectations. For example, our most recent episode, I talked to a woman who survived a murder attempt by her own son. But just the week before that, we just talked the whole time about Star Trek. We've had other recent episodes about sexting in languages that are not your first language, or what it's like to get weight loss surgery. It's unpredictable, it's real, it's honest, it's raw. Get Beautiful Anonymous wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey everyone, I am your host Peter Zablocki, and you're listening to History Shorts. I hope everyone's having a great day so far, and thank you for making this show a small part of that. If you'd like to help me out with a small gesture, please leave History Shorts a rating or a review, and click that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. For sources and books used as the basis for these episodes, how to advertise on the show, and other information such as a list of our upcoming guests on the Conversation series, or a link to our Patreon account where you can listen to exclusive episodes not heard here, please visit www.historyshortspodcast.com. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate podcast listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the globe, all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now and take your podcast experience to the next level. Having said all of that, the Mississippi territory of Natchez Trace of the early 19th century wound its way through more than 400 miles of native lands, thick forests, and scattered outposts of civilization. It was not merely a path, but a lifeline of commerce, connecting Nashville in the east to Natchez in the west, and cutting through the heart of Chickasaw territory. Here, authority was fractured, claimed by American military officers, territorial governors, native nations, and enslaved people seeking freedom. In 1811, it was on this very route, shadowed by the rising tensions of empire and slavery, that Andrew Jackson, a lawyer, militia general, and rising Southern power broker, came face to face with a challenge to his authority. And if you know anything about Andrew Jackson, he never took that lightly. Here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The story begins not with Jackson, but with the growing unrest in the Mississippi Territory. By the second decade of the 19th century, the region was swelling with American settlers, and with them, thousands of enslaved African Americans. The U.S. was rapidly expanding its dominion into native-held lands, particularly those of the Chickasaw and Chickasaw, through treaties, pressure, and encroachment. But within these borderlands, where American and indigenous sovereignty bled into one another, the movement of enslaved people created friction. Slaveholders frequently used the Natchez Trace to transport their enslaved property, and the route became notorious for runaway slaves seeking refuge with native groups or slipping into the wilderness. The situation reached a tipping point in 1811. Local native leaders and federal Indian agents began receiving growing numbers of complaints from both the Chickasaw and white settlers that whites traveling through the region were aiding enslaved people in escaping. Whether due to actual abolitionist sentiment, economic rivalry, or simple chaos on a road, these rumors alarmed authorities. The acting territorial governor responded decisively. Any white person traveling through Chickasaw territory with enslaved people would be required to present official papers of ownership. Without them, travelers risked having their slaves confiscated. The measure was framed as a bureaucratic tool, but it carried real power. It meant native authorities and federal agents could, at least temporarily, challenge a white man's dominion over other human beings. It was a direct affront to the absolute mastery men like Jackson believed that they held. And so enter Andrew Jackson, already a towering figure in Tennessee politics, slaveholder and self-fashioned defender of Southern honor. Jackson was in transit along the Natchez Trace, en route from his Tennessee estate to Natchez, possibly to attend a military or business affairs. With him were more than 24 enslaved men, some born into bondage on his property, others likely purchased at auction. Jackson, like many Southern elites, relied heavily on slave labor, not only for agriculture but also for personal prestige and logistical support during travel. Somewhere deep within Chickasaw lands, Jackson's party was halted by an Indian agent acting under orders from the governor. The agent demanded that Jackson provide documentation for each of the enslaved people that he was transporting. Jackson, to his fury, had no such papers. His ownership, in his view, needed no paperwork. It was manifest in his voice, his status, and the chains his slaves wore. To be asked for proof was to be challenged, as though the word of Andrew Jackson could be weighed like any common man's. What followed was one of the most surreal and violent displays of Jacksonian improvisation in the annals of frontier history. Denied passage and threatened with potential confiscation of his slaves, Jackson resolved to overpower the regulation with spectacle. He ordered the immediate removal of the shackles from his enslaved men, not as a gesture of mercy, but as a preparation for confrontation. Then, astonishingly, he handed out clubs, basically heavy wooden cudgels, to his slaves, arming them as though they were a militia. The enslaved were instructed not to flee, but to surround Jackson and form a phalanx-like guard as he marched them past the checkpoint. Jackson's gamble was calculated. By arming his slaves and presenting them as an organized guard, he hoped to present not a scene of vulnerability, but of control so complete that his very captives would fight for him. The visual impact must have been extraordinary. Dozens of black men, freshly unshackled, wielding blunt weapons under the command of a furious white master, marching through the tangled underbush of native lands in silence and defiance? Yeah, that must have been pretty crazy. The agent, faced with this forceful and strange spectacle, backed down. Jackson was allowed to pass with his human cargo intact. The armed slaves were eventually disarmed and returned to bondage. The moment passed into obscurity, buried under the swelling tide of Jackson's later triumphs. The War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, the Seminole Wars, and the presidency. But it remained for those who remembered, a story emblematic of who Jackson was: authoritarian, theatrical, and ruthless. Yet what should not be lost is what the moment reveals about the systems of power on the frontier. Jackson's actions were not simply those of a rogue individual, they were an extreme expression of Southern slaveholding logic. For Jackson and his class, slavery was not just an economic system. It was a social and political order that required absolute control. When challenged, even by an agent of the U.S. government, Jackson was willing to violate the very boundaries of that order, arming black men, risking escape, inviting scrutiny, so long as it reinforced his authority in the end. Now, arming of the enslaved, even temporarily back then, was profoundly taboo. Across the South, one of the core fears of slaveholders was armed insurrection. From the memory of the Stand-Up Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 to the fresh terrors of Haiti, where elites knew that the arming of slaves often led to rebellion, Jackson's decision was thus not just bold, it was dangerous. Jackson believed so completely in his dominion that he imagined even his armed slaves would not rebel. His confidence in their fear was his shield. Historians have since debated how to interpret this episode. Was it an act of desperation, of improvisation, or genius, or performative dominance? Perhaps it was all of those. But more than anything, it was an assertion of Jackson's worldview, that force, hierarchy, and intimidation would always triumph over law or ethics. It also illustrated the complexities of slavery in the frontier South. Enslavement was not static. It bent to terrain, politics, and improvisation. In the tangled sovereignty of the Natchez Trace, where native nations, federal law, and local rule coexisted uneasily, Jackson imposed his own version of order, forged from clubs and unspoken threats. But what if? What might have happened if, in that moment of unshackled mobility, some of Jackson's enslaved men had turned their weapons against their master? What if they had fled into the thick woods of Choctaw country, seeking refuge among people who, while not universally sympathetic to fugitives, were not governed by slave codes? That they did not speaks not only to the power Jackson wielded over them, but to the psychological terror and dislocation that slavery instilled. Thanks for listening.